Well, good morning to the second session in this conference that deals with climate. I'm Richard Slaughter. I do work with the Climate Impacts Group of the University of Washington. I am happy to be here in a conference that is hosted in part by the Korbel School of the University of Denver. I graduated from that school when Joe Korbel was still on the faculty and was dean of the school, which probably dates me more than anything else, but it's always been a very pleasant memory for me. What we're going to do this afternoon is that I'm going to talk about alternative approaches to amelioration of climate change. And because I expect that there are members of the audience who don't have a real extensive background in the science of climate change, I'm going to go through a little bit of the background of the problem, present the nature of the problem and the magnitude of the problem, and then go into some theory and some discussion of various approaches to the problem globally. The climate reality that we're facing is the current emissions in 1998 were 22.5 megatons of carbon, and this is carbon emissions only. It doesn't include nitrous oxides and methane and other greenhouse gases, many of which are more powerful in terms of their effect than carbon, but carbon is definitely the most predominant. By 2006, that had grown to 27 megatons, an increase of, let's say, about 23% in that 8-year period, despite the operation of the Kyoto Protocol. This chart, Don, do you by any chance have your pointer? Okay. Part of the reality. This chart shows various socioeconomic scenarios adopted by the International Panel on Climate Change for the amount of warming that we can expect from different scenarios of carbon use and economic growth. Now, the entire range runs from some reduction to basically increases into infinity, but the realistic range defined by the gray shading on the chart. The most optimistic of the scenarios, the B series, in this case B1, suggests an increase in carbon emissions through approximately 2040 and then a decline to 2100. Now, these are scenarios, they are not forecasts, because it's impossible to forecast a number of the variables that go into this, but collections of variable forecasts that give you the scenarios. The problem here is the pink line here is year 2000 constant concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Starting with 2000, we have a constant level of concentration. The B1 scenario is significantly higher than that. And we are beginning to notice the impact of the cumulative impact of carbon in the atmosphere in terms of warming, in terms of melting of the Arctic ice cap, the Greenland ice cap, and other effects. That continues and gets worse under constant concentrations. And we know, for example, that when the Arctic ice cap melts, the estimate for complete melting in the summer of the Arctic ice was, well, at one point it was after 2050, then it was 2035. Today the estimate is 2014, that ice will be gone. And the impact of that isn't just a little bit of rising sea levels. The impact of that is that ice reflects sunlight. It reflects the incoming solar radiation quite well. Blue water, dark blue water, tends to absorb that radiation. So that when that ice is gone, that reflectance is gone, the warming problem becomes worse and there's nothing that man can do about it. This estimate from David Victor, in 2000, total energy consumption globally was approximately 14 terawatts, of which 25% was zero carbon. And that includes hydro, solar, wind, nuclear, and biomass. 25% of the 14 terawatts, which isn't too awfully bad. But by 2050, to have maintained that pink line that was on the previous slide, we need to have 70% of all energy be from carbon-free sources, which means you've got to have 21 terawatts of new carbon-free energy in order just to maintain current concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So basically, that's 1.5 times total current production and consumption, and it all has to be carbon-free. Now, number of these charts come from the Exxon and ExxonMobil forecast, and obviously it's a forecast to 2030. And obviously, because it's forecast, and maybe because it's ExxonMobil, you might want to take it with a grain of salt, but understand that even if there are errors in these numbers, the errors are not large enough to significantly impact the message. Wind and solar, energy from wind and solar have been growing very rapidly over the last, well, here's where we are now. But the projection is that they grow very rapidly. 12.5% for wind, 9.5%, 10% for solar. That looks very good. But those are in the classification of other energy. Other energy is this chunk of, the wind and solar are this part of the total of other energy. And all other energy that is non-carbon, doesn't put out carbon emissions, is only this chunk of the total projected production in 2030. So the projected production of energy is not totally carbon-free. It's very heavily weighted toward carbon sources. Looking at shares of emissions and just the changes in that, and part of the reason for this is the fact that the Kyoto Protocol, largely for political reasons, but also for reasons of attempts, or at least rationalized in terms of social justice, that is, the argument that the developing world didn't really contribute to the carbon problem, they shouldn't bear the total onus or a large part of the onus of fixing it. And so the Kyoto Protocol focuses on industrial economies, and of those industrial economies other than Russia and other members of the former Soviet Union. In 1998, the industrial countries not exempted by the standard, 48.5% of total emissions, or less than half of it. Today, that's down to under 43%. On the other hand, the developing countries, China in particular, have gone from 39% to 47%. China accounts for 6% of that growth, and China's percentage of the United States has gone from 53 to 87%. So the trend in emissions is clearly heavily weighted toward countries' economies that are exempted from the current regime. A few slides here to point up the nature of the problem. The global population, and this is a 2030 forecast, but anyway, 80% of population growth over the next 20-some years is expected to be in the developing areas exempted from under the current regime. 3.2% annual growth rate in Asia Pacific, 0.4% in North America. Global GDP looks similar. You have fairly high rate of growth in North America, for example, and in Europe, but a much greater growth in Asia Pacific, including Central Asia and South Asia. Energy use coming off of those two factors, 0.6% increase in energy use annually in North America, 0.8% in Europe, 3.2% per year compounded in the Asia Pacific region. So the policy problem. Now what we tend to do is to focus on the regime. We create, well, I have here down domestic and international measures, but the Kyoto Protocol is an example of the regime that is established internationally to cause things to happen. So you create a regime which results in measures adopted by states party to the regime, intended to change human behavior, which then is expected to substantially reduce your problem. But it helps to focus on the problem rather than the regime in terms of deciding what would be the best way to go. To put it the other way around, what international regime most effectively changed human behavior to obtain the desired response? One way of looking at this is to look at carbon intensity of the various economies. Now, the existing regimes are predicated on a couple of standards that may not be very efficient at reducing the problem. One of these is per capita emissions. A book put out by the Council on Foreign Relations has an argument, and in terms of policy for the president, of by 2025 or 2030, equalizing per capita carbon emissions. Now, from a social justice standpoint, this makes all kinds of sense, but it ignores the huge differentials that exist in technology amongst various economies in the world, and it ignores, because of that, the opportunities for reducing emissions. Now, again, 27 million tons of carbon dioxide emitted in 2006 worldwide. This, and on per capita, that's 4.2 tons per capita worldwide, 11 tons in the developed countries of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, only less than 4 in China, and 19 in the United States. So you look at this particular chart and you come to the conclusion that the United States should be bearing the brunt of carbon emissions reduction. But let's look over here. If we adopt as a standard carbon and emissions, the intensity of carbon emissions per unit of GDP, and look at it, then the United States, if the world went to, let's see, to an American standard, you reduce emissions by 8 million megatons, or 8,000 megatons, 8 million megatons a year. That is about 30% of the total. So if the world was as efficient in terms of emissions per unit of GDP as the United States is, you'd get rid of 1/3 of the problem. If the world was as efficient as Japan, you'd eliminate 2/3 of the emissions and solve the problem. It's another way to look at it. Now, of course, the world isn't going to be as efficient as Japan because Japan is quite small. It's an island country. Most transport is by mass transportation, very few cars. The United States, on the other hand, has very large expanses and a lot of automobiles, not all of which, of course, we need to have, but part of it's because of the land mass. But that is a useful way of looking at things. Now, under the Kyoto, the point I want to make, or a side point here, is that in the Kyoto regime, Japan has a positive obligation to reduce its emissions. Russia, which, well, I have, yeah, Russia, and the former USSR doesn't have an obligation, nor, of course, does China or India. And that got screwed up. Okay, the have to use this anyway. The primary, the graphic is not supposed to be on there. The primary means in Kyoto and in a prospective successor regime is, number one, nation state basis for the obligation to reduce emissions, and secondly, starting from an level of absolute emissions in a base year. And in this case of Kyoto, that was 1990. But you have a base year, and as I mentioned before, you have a huge differential in the emissions intensity of these various economies. So that if the United States, while it produced at the time of Kyoto 25% of the world's emissions, and has a very high per capita number, if the United States is to take the lead in terms of absolute production, one of two things has to take place. One is that the standard of living in the United States comes down very significantly. And the other possibility is that the United States be able to push the envelope technologically well beyond where we are now in order to make our energy production almost entirely non-carbon. And if you think of the fact that the United States is already on the leading edge of that envelope, not that there can't be a lot of progress made, but we're already on the leading edge of that envelope, this isn't likely to happen. So the Kyoto understands this, and the primary means of addressing this huge disconnect between obligation to reduce and capacity to reduce, because the capacity to reduce is really much higher in Central Asia, in the former Soviet Union, including Russia, in China and India, because their economies are dirtier. So if they adopted our technology, we would resolve, I mean, throughout, you'd resolve a lot of the problem, provided, of course, they had our technology without a growth in their GDP, which isn't going to happen either. But anyway, there's a very large disconnect between obligation and capacity to effect reductions. The primary means by which the regime anticipates being handled this disconnect is the Clean Development Mechanism. Sorry, a senior moment here. The CDM, Clean Development Mechanism. And so the idea being that companies that have an obligation to reduce can in fact effect reductions in countries that don't have an obligation but do have opportunity, and thereby gain credits to offset their obligation. Now, this doesn't, I'll go into a minute why this isn't working, but logically, companies under this system have the option, three options really. One is they can clean up their own emissions and meet their obligation by reducing emissions. The second is that they can purchase credits, either under the CDM or a mechanism called joint implementation, or buy credits from Russia, which has a lot of what is called headroom, because their emissions in 1990 were higher than their emissions now because of the collapse of their industrial sector. They have a third option, though. They can move. They can move to a developing country that doesn't have an obligation. And I haven't seen anything in the literature that talks about that option. But economies are dynamic. people move, companies move. So I mean, we've heard the term outsourcing a lot, mainly in terms of loss of jobs. And if you're in the service sector, maybe you can't do that. But if you're in manufacturing, you can simply move to China if that's cheaper than one of the other options. Cap and trade in practice. One of the greenhouse gases to be controlled is HFC-23, which is a byproduct of the process producing HCFC-22. And if you're not familiar with these numbers, HCFC-22 is the substitute under the Montreal Protocol for Freon. And it's used in air conditioners, and it doesn't destroy the ozone layer as bad as Freon does. So but it produces, you get this byproduct. 1 kilogram of this product yields 3.15 euros of credits, or 2,800 euros per ton net. So 28 per ton of production of HCFC-22, you get 2,800 euros credits. The cost to actually destroy this gas from that production is 9 cents per kilogram, per kilo, not per ton, but per kilo. So the net gain is huge. And one of the countries gaining significant benefit from this is South Korea. Because under Kyoto, South Korea is underdeveloped. So there are a number of plants in South Korea producing this gas, and I will say that in the United States this gas is produced as well by DuPont, among others. But the American producers burn off this stuff just as a matter of course. South Korea burns it off to earn credits to sell to European companies under the European trading system, and make a whole lot of money in the process. Another one, adipic acid, which is a nylon feedstock, has a net subsidy of 720 euros per ton of nitrous oxide produced, and this is the nitrous oxide that is the greenhouse gas. So in 2010, a subsidy, you'll have a subsidy of 259 million euros for a cost of 5.5 euros, 5.5 million. So it's 100 to 1. Cap and trade, it's applied at the national level. It's traded internationally under United Nations auspices and issuance of credits. It's project-based for individual impacts only through their downstream effects. Now, one of the things that happens with this stuff is that it's incredibly overhead intensive. The lawyers, the accountants, the UN bureaucrats, every project has to be certified. All of the credits, the gains have to be certified so that people aren't cheating. But as we know, you set up a system of rules, people can game the system. Always going to happen. There is an article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs which looks at the European trading system and asks the question, how does the United States adopt a trading system that doesn't have this problem? And they go through a number of mistakes made by the Europeans. And one of these is the use of the clean development mechanism, and suggest that the American system pretty much avoid CDM credits. But if you avoid CDM credits, you lose the entire purpose of resolving this disconnect between obligation and capacity. I hesitate to do this, but I want to make a real short detour through economic theory, provide a couple of definitions, because the words private and social get bandied around ideologically in ways that are different than what I the ways I use those terms. A private return is a return to me in my private capacity for my own effort, not just my capital contribution, but my own labor. That's private return. Social return is return to society as a whole. But where the usual discourse is different than the way most economists use it is that social return includes all private returns. So, yeah. Let's do it this way. And one distinction I want to make, we look at a term that is in widespread use is the global commons. And the environment has been considered to be part of the global commons, common to everyone, owned by no one. I am of the view that instead of viewing the environment as the global commons, and I'm sure everyone has heard the term tragedy of the commons, which basically is the fact that since the commons belong to no one, it is free to be exploited by anyone at zero cost. So if I pollute the air, if it's part of the commons, then I'm free to do that. On the other hand, if the environment is a capital stock that actually belongs to someone, then there will be someone interested in protecting their returns from that resource. The distinction really is one probably more of philosophy than anything else, but it's a matter of trying to, on the one hand, you're trying to prevent people from polluting something just to prevent them from polluting it, and on the other hand, you're trying to cause people to pay for their pollution in a way that puts a price on it, and in doing that, you create the potential for someone else to gain, to profit from reducing that level of pollution. One chart I put together on the social and private returns, and I don't want to spend much time on this, but in terms of growth of economies and solutions to problems such as the ones we face, social returns and private returns can be positive or negative. If they are both positive, you have competitive markets and generally self-reinforcing growth. And some of the features of this quadrant are limited government, and that means not lower taxes, it means constraints on arbitrary exercise of executive power and et cetera. Securities regulation, and sideboard, which is Don Reading's term, on market interactions. That is, the society as an owner of this resource or as the regulator of the market can prescribe certain kinds of activities that are not to take place, because competitive markets work where you have a lot of buyers and sellers of fairly uniform products or services. If you don't have, where things aren't so unique or so specific that if I own them, I can charge any price I want. You don't have that situation. If they are both negative, you have the former Soviet Union, which is why a lot of economists have known for a very long time that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, that socialism was not going to be the wave of the future, even in the 50s, that it was going to collapse. Because you have public rent seeking. You have the public taking returns from everyone. If you have positive private and negative social, you have monopolies, private rent seekings. Robber barons are an example. I think of Microsoft Windows as an example. Where the quality of the product, where the product has had such a huge market share that its quality didn't make much difference. Microsoft has been able to get away with shoddy product for a very long period of time, and everyone complains about it, but it never gets fixed. And this one, which is preferred to some extent, you basically wind up with withdrawal of service. And a great example is passenger rail in the United States. My wife and I were on a train going home from the first quarter at DU when Union Pacific still ran the Portland Roads. And this train went from here through Wyoming into Idaho and stopped in Wyoming for an hour at a time, several places waiting for mail that wasn't going to show up because it was traveling by air. The car we were in wasn't heated and Wyoming was 45 below that night. Union Pacific did everything they could to get out of the obligation to provide passenger rail, and they ultimately succeeded. Well, the problem we have now is the healthcare system. We have a huge free rider problem. The answer has been, particularly with Medicare and Medicaid, to force down reimbursements, which causes physicians to exit the system. So in the near term, long term, that's not going to solve the problem. An efficient emissions regime, from my analysis, is going to do 5 things. 1, it creates a market for pollution control. So you have to price the pollution. And that price should ideally be uniform globally. It should automatically reward positive behavioral change, and not just by companies, and not just in terms of large-scale projects. It should reward positive behavioral change by individuals. That is, I save money by switching from coal or oil to natural gas, or to solar or to wind energy to heat my house. I save money by insulating my house. I save money by moving from 15 miles to the gallon to 50. I mean, all of these ways I save money. I should save money, and so should utilities. It should avoid confounding agendas. That is, I have a lot of difficulty with attempting to achieve social welfare objectives or social equity objectives in the climate regime. I don't think we should be focused on social justice in the third world. I don't think we should be focused on whether people have contributed or not, because we don't have time for that. And also because, in my view, if you do it the right way, then you promote economic growth in the third world as part of the effects of the regime. But the climate change, to me, is the global security problem of the 21st century. It's the global security problem in terms of getting something done of the first quarter of the 20th century, because if we don't get it done by then, it may be too late. You should realize maximum effect from private investment decisions with a minimum of regulation. That is, the regulation should be focused on the transparency and ethics of the process, and not on the outcomes. The Norwegians, as an example, have adopted a carbon tax, but they have applied it in a differential way amongst industries, so that some parts of the economy are exempt and some parts of it pay the full tax. When you do that, you cause distortions in the economy and you reduce the effect of your regime. And you require more regulation. And it should produce the minimum necessary internal disruption within any country, as is obvious from the reaction of the United States Senate to the Kyoto in the 1990s. The tax alternative. The global community has sort of decided that taxes aren't possible because Americans don't like taxes, because the Chinese aren't going to sign on to it, the Indians won't sign on to it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can't do taxes. To which I suppose I reply that you don't have any other choice if we're going to solve the problem. Plus, it can be done in such a way that it really doesn't disrupt people's economies. The effects are cumulative. Part of the things that don't come into the discussion are that you don't have to set a carbon tax at $1,000 a ton. You can set a carbon tax at more like $25 or $30 a ton, which would translate into maybe 25 cents a gallon on gasoline. And at the end of 2008, we shouldn't really care about a 25-cent differential in gas prices that much. The signal is more important than the initial level. You don't have to start at a point which causes massive amounts of behavioral change, because you're interested in setting up a dynamic. Not only do you want individuals to consume less carbon energy, you want entrepreneurs to invest in carbon-free energy. And that takes time, and if I'm going to invest in something, it's helpful if I know that the returns on that investment are going to be positive and are likely to rise over time. If I don't know that, if it's like it's a tax subsidy, everybody likes tax incentives. But if it's a tax subsidy, as is evident from policy this year, I don't know that